Hello everyone. Welcome back to Mr. Darkvale. Tonight, we're bringing you 10 of the most disturbing true trucker stories ever submitted to this channel. These accounts come from long-haul drivers who've spent years alone on Alaska's most remote highways. Not campfire inventions, but the words of people who actually live on those roads. Every story here is too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss as coincidence. We cross-checked what we could. Dispatch logs, mile markers, weather records from the nights in question. And each account connects to something real and documented, long before it ever reached us. Before tonight ends, you'll hear about a light that trails a truck for hours without ever closing the distance. A voice on a Dead Sea B channel that knows a driver's name and her exact rig, and a turnoff that exists for one night and is never found again in daylight. This channel is built on slow-burning, authentic horror over cheap jump scares, the kind that stays with you long after the video ends. So if that's what you came for, subscribe and turn that bell on. And if you've lived something like this yourself, alone on a highway with no one around for 100 miles, tell us in the comments. Your story may be the next one we uncover. Now, before we begin, kill your dome light and let's get started. I've been hauling fuel up the Dalton Highway for 35 years now. And if you asked me to name the best job I ever had, I'd still tell you it was that road, especially back in the early years. Before I got smart enough to be scared of it. Most people hear haul road and think about ice and semis jackknifed in a ditch, and sure, that's part of it. But what I loved was the quiet. 400 some miles of nothing between Fairbanks and Prudhoe Bay. No billboards, no radio stations except what bounced off the pipeline stations. Just you and the truck, and about 18 hours of your own thoughts. I used to tell my wife it was the closest thing to church I ever found. I mean that. There's a kind of silence out there that doesn't feel empty. It feels full, like the land is just resting. This particular run was February of '94. I'd been doing the route maybe 7 years by then. Long enough to know it the way you know the walk from your bed to your bathroom in the dark. Clear morning, 38 below, at the terminal outside Fairbanks, tanker full of diesel, headed for the rigs. Nothing about the dispatch sheet stood out. Nothing about the sky stood out. I remember thinking it was going to be a good day because the wind was down and the visibility was about as good as you ever get in February, which isn't saying much, but it's saying something. The first thing that snagged in my head, and I want to be honest, at the time it didn't even register as a thing, was the animals. That stretch before the Yukon River crossing, Ian, so you always see something. Ravens working a frozen carcass. Maybe a moose bedded down in the black spruce. Fox tracks crossing the road in a string like stitching. I'd made that drive. Enough times I didn't even look for it anymore. I just absorbed it. The way you absorb streetlights on a drive you've done 1,000 times in the city. That morning there was nothing. Not a raven. Not a track in the fresh snow on either shoulder. I actually remember glancing at the odometer, like some part of my brain wanted to mark the moment, and thinking, must have snowed after the last critter came through. Simple as that. I didn't think about it again for almost an hour. Somewhere past the Yukon River Bridge, I picked up the CB out of habit. More for company than information. Channel 19 usually had somebody on it, truckers running the opposite direction, pipeline maintenance crews, somebody complaining about the grade at Beaver Slide. That morning, nothing. Just the hiss you get when nobody's keying up. I figured I was early, or everybody else was late, and I let it go. What actually put a small cold pin through the morning was the meeting point. There's a wide spot before Coldfoot where southbound and northbound trucks tend to cross paths. Just because of how the schedules run out of both terminals. I'd been told at dispatch that morning there were 2 other rigs running south. That day, guys I knew, one of them a fella named Dale, who I'd shared coffee with more mornings than I could count. By my math, based on when he'd have left Prudhoe, I should have passed him a good 20 minutes before that wide spot. I didn't. I kept my eyes on the road, thinking I'd see his lights come around the bend any second, and they never came. I told myself he left late. Trucks leave late. It happens every day of the week. But that's when I turned the CB up loud. And that's when it got strange in a way I couldn't talk myself out of. It wasn't just empty air anymore. There was a hiss, but it wasn't the flat hiss of no signal. It had a rhythm to it, like it was breathing in and out, louder, then softer, on maybe a 10-second cycle. My first thought, and I want you to understand, I'm a practical man. I was raised by a father who fixed diesel engines for a living. My first thought was that something was wrong with my rig, a loose connection at the antenna mount, moisture in the coax, something mechanical and boring. I pulled over at the next turnout, killed the engine, climbed up and checked the antenna with bare hands in 30 below, which tells you how much it was bothering me. Connection was solid, ice-free. I got back in, keyed the mic, said a test call into dead air, and the pulse kept right on going, in and out, like it didn't care whether I was listening or not. A bad connection you can fix. A pulse like that, coming from nowhere, doing its own thing regardless of what you do to your equipment, that's a different animal. And it sat wrong with me in a way I didn't have a word for yet. I got to Coldfoot a little before noon. And I'll tell ya, I was glad to see the lights of that truck stop the way you're glad to see your own porch light air after a long drive. Place was open, generator running, smell of coffee. But it was empty in a way that Coldfoot never is at that hour. Usually you've got 2, 3 rigs parked, drivers thawing out, somebody's dog underfoot. That day there was 1 truck besides mine, and it belonged to the man behind the counter who wasn't going anywhere. I asked him, casual as I could make it, how traffic was running. He shrugged and said it'd been light, real light. Hadn't seen more than his own truck since he opened up. He said it the way you'd comment on the weather. No weight to it at all, and that offhand tone bothered me more than if he'd seemed worried. The coffee pot on the burner had gone from full to scorched black at the bottom, which meant it had been sitting there a long while with nobody pouring a cup. There was a logbook at the counter, the kind drivers signed just so dispatch had a paper trail of who'd passed through, and when, mostly for search and rescue purposes if a truck went missing on the pass. I flipped it open while I signed my name, more out of habit than curiosity. And what I found stopped my hand for a second. The entry above mine, the last southbound signature in that book, was my own, from a run the week before. A full week of southbound traffic, and according to that book, I was the only driver who'd come through, going that direction in 7 days. That didn't square with anything. Trucks ran that route daily. I knew for a fact trucks had run it daily, because I'd talked to some of those drivers myself at the terminal. Either the book was wrong, or something else was, and standing there in that warm little building with the smell of burnt coffee, I genuinely could not tell you which possibility scared me less. I got back on the road because that's what you do. There's a load to deliver, and no other option out there but forward. Etagun Pass was ahead of me, the one stretch on the whole route that actually deserves the reputation, steep grade, wind that comes down off the Brooks Range, like it's got somewhere urgent to be. Except that day the wind wasn't doing what it does at Adigun. I've driven that pass in every kind of weather there is, and there's a particular crosswind pattern the terrain funnels through, predictable as clockwork, strong enough most days to push a loaded tanker sideways if you're not paying attention. That day, nothing. Dead calm on a stretch of road that is never, ever calm. My exhaust went straight up behind me like a chimney on a still morning in town, not a haul road climbing 8,000 feet through a mountain pass in February. About 20 minutes past the summit, I came across tire tracks in the fresh snow ahead of me, running my direction, clean and recent, maybe an hour old at most. For a second, my whole chest loosened up, because tracks meant somebody was out here after all. Somebody I might catch up to, might even be Dale. I followed them for maybe a quarter mile before I realized they just stopped, not pulled off, not swerved. They ran dead center in the lane, and then the snow was untouched, like the truck had been picked straight up off the road. I stopped my rig right there, climbed down into the cold, and walked out along where the tracks ended, looking for anything, a turnoff, drift that might have buried a continuation. Anything that would let this make sense. There wasn't a side road for miles. There wasn't a drop-off. There was just snow that had tracks in it, and then didn't. And the only story I could tell myself, wind scour, a gust lifting fresh powder and resettling it smooth, felt about as convincing as it sounds saying it out loud now. I climbed back in and drove, because there wasn't another option. And somewhere in that stretch I noticed something about the time that I still can't square. I know that road by feel, mile marker to mile marker. I could tell you within a couple minutes how long any given stretch takes me loaded at a safe speed. There's a run of about 11 miles past the pass, where I always clock somewhere around 14, 15 minutes. I glanced at my watch going in, and when I came out the other side and checked it against the next marker, 40 minutes had passed. 40. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't slowed for anything I could remember. I sat with that for a good while, running through it, wondering if I'd dozed at the wheel doing 60 on a mountain pass, which should have ended with me in a ravine, not driving along fine like nothing happened. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. The lights started doing something wrong not long after that. Up there in February, you get a short gray window of something like daylight, and then a long blue dusk that can last a couple hours before real dark sets in. And I know how that dusk falls. I know which side of the truck the shadows ought to lengthen on, depending on the time of day. That afternoon, the shadows off the guardrail posts were falling wrong, stretched out on a side that didn't match where the light was coming from, or seemed to be coming from. I actually slowed down and looked at it for a solid minute, trying to work out an explanation involving cloud cover or reflection off the snowpack, and never landed on one that satisfied me. I just kept driving, because there is no pulling over in your own head out there. There's only the road. The radio gave me one more thing before I made it to Sagwan. A single click through the static, sharp, like somebody keying a mic and letting it go without saying a word. I waited. 10, 15 seconds. Another click, same interval, same nothing behind it. It did that maybe 6 or 7 times before it faded back into that breathing hiss. No voice, no words. Just a presence on the channel that had no message for me, which somehow felt worse than if it had. I'm not a nervous driver. 35 years, I've never laid a rig down, never had so much as a serious slide. But somewhere in that last hour, before Franklin Bluffs, I looked down at my speedometer, and I was doing 62 on glare ice, a stretch I take at 35, on a good day with dry pavement, let alone black ice in February. I don't remember deciding to press the pedal down. I just remember noticing my foot was already there, and some part of me wanted that stretch of road behind me so bad it had overridden 35 years of training without asking permission first. I eased off, made myself breathe, made myself get back down to a sane speed, and I white-knuckled the last hour into Prudhoe like I was outrunning a storm that wasn't actually on the radar. When I pulled into the yard at Dead Horse, I about could have kissed the mud, if there'd been any that wasn't frozen solid. Unloaded the tanker, went in to warm up and get my paperwork signed, and made small talk with a couple of the yard guys the way you do after a long haul. I mentioned, just making conversation, that it had been a strange, quiet run, hadn't seen another truck the whole way. One of them, a dispatcher named Pete, who I'd known a few years, got a funny look and pulled a clipboard off the wall. Turned out there'd been a call that morning rerouting all southbound and one other northbound rig off the Hall Road for a weather advisory out of Coldfoot. Ice fog reported on the radio, except nobody could find a record of who'd actually issued that advisory. And nobody had bothered to radio it through to my truck before I left the terminal. Far as anybody could tell, for that stretch of hours, I was the only vehicle dispatch had moving on that entire road, and there wasn't a single name attached to the decision that kept everybody else off it. Pete laughed it off as somebody dropping the ball on the paperwork. I didn't laugh. I just signed what I needed to sign and went and sat in the break room a long while before I trusted myself to talk to anybody else. I drove that road another 20-some years after that, hauled fuel right up until I retired, and never once had another day like it. Everything about that stretch went back to being exactly what it always was: ravens and fox tracks, and Dale's voice on Channel 19 complaining about the grade. I never found out what the advisory was, or who called it, or why the animals cleared out that one morning, or where those tracks in the snow went. I've turned it over more nights than I'd like to admit, and I've never landed anywhere but back at the start. But to this day, even now, decades retired, if I'm driving that road for old time's sake in the middle of July with the sun up at midnight and tourists snapping pictures at the pass, there's still one stretch past Adigun where I ease off the gas without deciding to, where I find myself watching the tree line a little too close, where some old part of my brain that was there that February morning in '94 just quietly tells the rest of me to get on through and not look too long at what's around it. I can't tell you why. I just know I listen to it every single time. 3 falls in a row I drove supply runs on the Denali Highway, and out of everything that happened to me out there, this is the one I still think about the most. Not because it hurt me. It never touched me. That's the whole reason it stays with me. For those 3 years, I hauled propane, dry goods, and mail out to a lodge about 70 miles in from the Cantwell side, past McLaren Summit, out where a road stops being a road in any normal sense and turns into washboard gravel with no shoulder, no guardrail, and no cell signal for over 100 miles. The state stops grading it and pulls the plow trucks off it by mid-October. So every September there's a last run, and that year, 2022, I drew the last run. I left Cantwell later than I wanted. A guy at the fuel stop held me up, talking about a moose he'd hit the week before, and by the time I got loaded and rolling, the light was already going gray at the edges. I'd never driven that stretch after dark before. 3 seasons, and I always plan around it. Because once the sun's down out there, you're not driving past scenery anymore. You're driving inside a tunnel made of your own headlights. And everything past 40 feet just doesn't exist. About 2 hours in, past the summit, I checked my mirror out of habit, and there was a light behind me. Low. Single lamp, not a pair, which meant either a motorcycle or a four-wheeler. And my first reaction wasn't fear, it was annoyance. I remember thinking, some idiot's going to ride a bike out here. 2 weeks before this road shuts for winter, and then I'm going to be the guy who has to stop and help him when he lays it down on the washboard. I slowed at the next pullout to let him come up and pass me. Figured he didn't want to eat my dust the whole way. He didn't pass. He didn't even close the gap. He held back at the exact same distance he'd been at before I slowed down, like he'd slowed down the same amount at the same second I did. Which is possible, sure, if he's paying close attention. I didn't think much of it right then. I got back up to speed and kept going. About 20 minutes later, I tried it again, this time the other direction. I put my foot down on a straight stretch, watched my speedometer climb, watched the mirror. If he was hanging back to be polite, he'd fall behind now. He didn't. The gap stayed exactly the same, like it was welded to me, like there was a bar connecting my back bumper to wherever he was sitting. That's the first time something in my chest tightened up a little, not full-on scared yet. Just that low click in your gut when a piece of a puzzle doesn't fit the way it's supposed to. Not long after that, we hit a grade. There's a long climb out past the summit where the road repulls at anything with less horsepower than a truck. And I know from watching bikes and ATVs on that road for 3 years that they lose ground on that hill every single time, even the fast ones, because the gravel eats their momentum. And they don't have the torque to fight it back. I watched my mirror the whole way up that grade, waiting to see him drop back, because physically he should have. He didn't drop back 1 foot. He came up that hill sitting in my mirror exactly where he'd been, at the bottom of it. Like the hill wasn't there for him. I grabbed my CB, more out of habit than anything, and keyed it. Asked if he was doing all right back there, told him he could come around any time. No rush. Nothing but static. I let it sit open for a second longer than I needed to, and I want to be honest. I thought I heard something in that static that wasn't just static. Some kind of low tone underneath it, there and gone, before I could decide if I'd actually heard it or just wanted to. I clicked off and told myself it was nothing. That's when the weather started registering to me the way it should have from the start. It was maybe 34 degrees. There was sleet coming sideways hard enough that my wipers couldn't keep the glass clean. And out on the flats before the summit, the wind was strong enough that it was pushing my truck a foot sideways in its lane. No one rides a motorcycle in that. Not on bald highway tires on wet gravel. Not in wind that could put a bike on its side. Not 2 weeks before the road closes for good. I sat there doing the math on that for a few miles, and every version of it came out the same. Nobody was out there on a bike. Which meant I didn't actually know what was behind me. There's a bend past the flats where the road drops behind a shoulder of the hillside for a few seconds. Enough that anything behind you disappears from your mirror completely. You lose the line of sight, and then the road curves back and you pick it back up. I've watched other vehicles vanish and reappear at that bend 100 times over 3 years. I watched for it that night specifically, almost hoping it would just not be there when the road came back around, that it'd have turned off somewhere I couldn't see. It came back into the mirror in the exact same spot it had been in before it disappeared, like it never lost the sight line to me at all, even though the hill should have blocked it exactly the same way it was blocking me from seeing it. I thought back, right about then, to something the cook at the lodge had said to me the year before, some older guy who'd worked out there longer than I'd been alive. We were sitting by the stove one night, and he mentioned, almost like a throwaway line, that a few drivers over the years had talked about a light that rides behind you out past the summit and never comes any closer. And he'd laughed it off at the time, called it road hypnosis. Said driving that flat empty stretch at night does things to your eyes. I'd laughed too. I wasn't laughing thinking about it now. I dug my phone out of the cup holder, more for something to do with my hands than any real plan, and held it up toward the mirror to snap a picture, thinking at least I'd have something to show somebody. Proof I wasn't losing it. The picture came back black, not blurry, not grainy, just black, like there was nothing back there to catch it all, even though my own eyes were looking right at it the whole time I took the shot. I told myself cameras are bad in low light. That's not proof of anything, but it didn't sit right. That the one clear light on that entire stretch of dark highway didn't show up on a lens pointed straight at it. I set my cruise control after that, locked in a dead steady 50, wanting one clean test I couldn't second guess myself on. If a person on a bike is matching your speed by hand for that long, over rough gravel in the wind, there's going to be drift. They're going to gain a little, lose a little, correct for it. I watched that mirror for what felt like 10 straight minutes, and the gap never moved. Not a foot in either direction. No human being holds a motorcycle at a fixed distance but behind another vehicle for 10 minutes, straight on that road. I don't think anyone could do it even trying, in daylight, on dry pavement. And then I noticed the thing that actually got under my skin the worst. My truck was getting hammered by that washboard, my whole cab shaking, my own headlight beams jumping with every bump. In the mirror, that light didn't move at all. No bounce, no flicker, nothing. It sat there like a dot painted on the glass. Whatever was making that light wasn't riding on wheels, taking the same beating mine were. Right about then, my temp gauge started creeping up past where I liked it, and I remembered I hadn't topped off before I left Cantwell, wanting to just get moving. I did the math on my tank and didn't love the number I got. Out there, that's a real problem, a truck problem. Nothing to do with the light, except now I had two things stacking on top of each other. One behind me and one under my hood, and only one set of hands to deal with either. A few miles later, a strap on my trailer worked loose and started snapping in the wind, loud enough I could hear it over the engine. And I had no choice. I had to pull over and get out and retie it. I stood on that gravel in the sleet with the wind cutting through my jacket, and for the first time all night, I wasn't looking at that light through glass. I was standing in the open with it. It had stopped exactly where I'd stopped, same distance. Sitting there in the dark, not moving, not coming any closer, while I stood outside my truck with my back half turned to it, tying down a strap with fingers that had gone numb. I've never gotten back in a vehicle faster in my life. Not 15 minutes after I got moving again, I saw a second set of headlights coming the other direction. A real pair, paired lamps, a truck. First actual sign of another human being in hours. I flashed my lights at him as we came up on each other, thought about stopping him, and as we passed, I leaned toward my window and lifted a hand, and he just gave me a normal wave back, like it was any other night on that road. No slowing down, no look in his mirror, nothing. I watched his taillights in my mirror as he went, and for 1 second right, as he passed the spot where my light was sitting, his brake lights flared just a touch, like he'd caught something out of the corner of his eye worth tapping the brakes for. Then he kept going. I never found out if he saw it or if that was nothing. I checked the dash clock somewhere after that, planning how much longer I had until Paxson, and the number didn't match what I felt like I'd been driving. I'd have sworn I was maybe 40 minutes past the bend by the hillside. The clock said closer to 2 hours. I checked it against my phone, thinking the truck's clock had drifted and they matched each other, which meant it wasn't the clock that was wrong. The sky started going gray a while after that. That first float-hour actual sunrise, still hours from full daylight, but enough to flatten the black out of the sky at the edges. And that's when it happened. The only thing it ever did the entire night. In my mirror, without speeding up, without slowing down, without swinging wide like a vehicle turning off onto a side trail, that light just angled off the road out into the open tundra where there's no trail, no track, nothing out there for anything on wheels to go, and it got smaller against that gray horizon until it wasn't there anymore. No sound, no flare. It didn't do anything on the way out any more than it had done anything the whole time it was behind me. It just stopped being there. I made it into Paxson a while after that and sat in my truck outside the store for a long time before I went in. I didn't tell anybody that day. I didn't tell anybody for months, honestly, because I didn't have a single thing to point to. It never got closer. It never made a sound I could swear to. It never did one single thing except be exactly where it was, exactly as far back as it started, the whole night. It was almost a year later, sitting at the bar in Cantwell at the end of the following season, that I finally brought it up to another guy who drove freight out that same road, different years than me, never overlapped with me once. I hadn't even finished describing it, just got to the part about a single low light, holding a distance that never changed no matter what I did. And he set his glass down and looked at me and said, "Quiet." Like he didn't love saying it out loud, that it had happened to him too, different year, same stretch past the summit, same distance that never closed and never fell back. He hadn't told anybody either. Neither of us had an explanation then, and I still don't have one now. I've thought about it more than anything else that ever happened to me on that road, more than the moose, more than the trucks I've seen slide off into the ditch, more than any of it. And I think it's because there's nothing to resolve. It never chased me. It never threatened me. It just followed, at a distance that broke every rule I know about how a vehicle, a person, or an animal is supposed to move. And then at first light, it walked off into a place nothing walks off into, and it was gone. I've been driving the Richardson Highway for over 20 years now, mostly running the stretch between Delta Junction and Fairbanks, sometimes further south toward Glen Allen, when somebody needs it bad enough to pay for the miles. You learn things doing this job for 2 decades that don't show up in any manual. You learn the highway breathes different at 40 below than it does in July. You learn which mile markers eat headlights whole in the ice fog. And you learn, or you're taught pretty quick if you grew up out here, that you don't leave a person standing on the shoulder in that kind of cold. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter what your gut says. Interior Alaska in February isn't a place that forgives you for driving past somebody. It'll kill a person in under an hour if the wind's got any teeth to it. And everybody who's lived out here long enough has either been that person stranded or known somebody who was or buried somebody who wasn't picked up in time. That's the only reason I stopped for him. I want to say that plain, right up front. because for a long time afterward I turned that decision over and over, trying to figure out where I went wrong. And the honest answer is, I didn't. Stopping wasn't the mistake. It's just what came after that I still think about, some nights more than others. This was February of 2006. I'd dropped a fare at the airport in Fairbanks, and I was running back down empty toward Delta. No radio traffic, nothing on the road but me, and about 6 inches of hard-packed snow, reflecting my own headlights back into my eyes. Somewhere past the old Shaw Creek turnoff, I saw him, just a shape, at first, a dark vertical line against all that white, walking the shoulder with his back to me. No reflective tape, no flashers behind him, nothing. No vehicle in sight either direction. Not pulled off, not in a ditch, nothing. Just a man walking in weather that was sitting somewhere around 35 below, with the wind chill factored in. I almost didn't stop. I want to be honest about that too. I slowed down, and I looked at him in my mirror after I passed. And I had that little argument with myself that I think every driver out here has had at some point. The one where you weigh the chance he's dangerous against the certainty that leaving him means maybe he doesn't make it to morning. I turned around about a quarter mile up. Habit and guilt, mostly guilt, got the better of the caution. When I pulled alongside him and rolled the window down enough to talk, that's when the first thing landed wrong, though I didn't have the words for it yet. He wasn't hunched over. He wasn't hugging himself or stamping his feet, the way a person does when they've been out in that cold any real length of time. He turned around, almost easy, like he'd heard me coming a while back and had just been waiting for me to make up my mind. And when he got in, his jacket was zipped, his hood was up, his gloves were on, and everything about him dressed correct for the weather, which doesn't sound like much until you've actually seen somebody who's really been stranded out here. They don't look put together. They look like they've been fighting the cold and losing. He looked like a man who'd stepped outside to check the mail. I told myself he was just tougher than most. Some people are. I've picked up trappers and hunters over the years who treat 40 below like a light jacket day, so I let it go. He gave his name easy enough when I asked. Said it was Curtis. Said his truck had thrown a rod about 8 miles back and he'd been walking since, trying to get to Fairbanks for a job interview at the pipeline yard the next morning. Had a story ready, details in it, the kind of specifics that usually mean somebody's telling the truth. Because liars tend to keep things vague. I didn't see the truck he was talking about, but 8 miles is 8 miles, and you don't always spot a vehicle pulled well off the road at night. I didn't push on it. We talked. He was polite. Asked about the job, asked about the highway, laughed at the right places when I made a joke about the cold. For a good 20 minutes, it was about as unremarkable a fare as I'd had all winter, and I remember actually relaxing into it. Glad I'd turned the truck around. It was somewhere around there he said my name. Not ma'am, not hey there, but my actual name, Ruth, dropped into the conversation like we'd been introduced somewhere before. I hadn't told him. I know I hadn't, because I always introduce myself right at the start of a fare. It's just habit. And I hadn't done it this time on account of the weather and getting him warmed up first. When I asked him how he knew it, he just tapped the little laminated permit clipped to my visor, the one with my name and my cab number on it that the borough makes all of us display. Made perfect sense. I laughed it off. Told myself I was getting jumpy over nothing, that a woman alone on a dark highway with a stranger is naturally going to read into things that don't mean anything. But it kept happening. Small things, one after another, none of them big enough on their own to be anything. I made some comment a few miles on, something like, "This stretch'll eat your gas gauge alive in this cold." Just the kind of thing you say to fill the quiet. 10, 15 minutes later, talking about something else entirely, he used almost the same words back to me. Same rhythm, same phrasing, just slotted into a different sentence. I noticed it because it was my sentence, not something people commonly say. I told myself people pick up phrases from each other in conversation all the time, that it didn't mean a thing, and mostly I believed that. Mostly. Then, coming up on a bend I know well, I mentioned there'd been a moose carcass along there a few days back, hit by a semi, that the ravens had been working it. He said, before we'd even come around the curve, that it'd be gone by now, that the wolves usually clean those up inside a week this time of year. And he was right. It was gone. Which isn't impossible. Wolves do clean up a carcass fast in winter, but it meant he knew that stretch. Knew it well enough to guess correctly at something with real specificity. And he'd told me not 20 minutes earlier he was from out of state, that he'd only driven the Richardson a handful of times. I started watching him out of the corner of my eye after that. Not obviously, I hoped, just letting my attention drift his direction more than it should for polite conversation. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't show it. The thing that really turned my stomach, though, came almost an hour in. We got to talking, the way you do, about the kind of people I pick up on this run, and I mentioned, just making conversation, that I'd had an odd one a few weeks back. A young woman out near Paxson who I'd picked up crying at a pullout, running from a boyfriend who'd apparently gotten rough with her. Wouldn't say much else about it, just needed a ride into town. I hadn't told that story to more than one or two people. Certainly never anybody outside the family, and definitely never a stranger. Curtis nodded along like it was old news to him, and said, "Yeah, I heard she never did go back to him." Said it plain, like a fact, like something everybody just knew. Nobody knew that. I didn't even know that. I dropped her off and never heard another word about her life after that, good or bad. There was no way for him to know whether she went back to that man or not. Unless he knew something about her, I didn't, and there was no reason on earth a stranger, walking the Richardson Highway in a snowstorms, should know anything at all about a woman I'd picked up weeks before, at a different pullout, on a different night. I didn't say anything right away. I just drove, and I felt the whole cab get smaller around me, the heater suddenly too loud, my own hands too tight on the wheel. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted there to be some ordinary explanation. Small towns being small, word getting around, coincidence doing what coincidence does. But something underneath all my reasoning had already made its decision, and it was telling me to get this man out of my truck as soon as I possibly could without letting him know I was scared. So I tested him, the way you do when you're trying to talk yourself out of your own fear and into it at the same time. I glanced at the dash, which was sitting comfortably over half a tank, and said I was surprised, that I must be running low, that we might need to swing by the stations outside Delta before I could take him all the way in. He looked at the gauge without me pointing at it and said, "You're fine. You've got more than half. Flat. Certain. No hesitation." Like he'd already clocked that gauge earlier and filed it away. Like he already knew this truck, this dash, this exact needle position, better than a man meeting it for the first time had any business knowing it. That was the moment I stopped pretending to myself. Somewhere around mile 270, I keyed the CBC and put on my dispatch voice, told an empty channel that I had a change of plans, that I needed to swing off toward the checkpoint because a trooper wanted a word about a fare mix-up, made the whole thing up whole cloth, hoping it would spook him into wanting out before we got that far. He didn't argue. He just looked at me for a second too long, calm as anything, and said, "You don't need to make something up, Ruth. You could have just asked me to get out." Then he smiled, small, not unkind exactly, and told me to pull off at the next wide spot. I did. He got out easy, thanked me for the ride, said something like, "Drive safe, you're good at this," and shut the door soft, like he was being considerate of the cold coming in. Didn't slam it, didn't linger, just walked off into the dark toward Delta on foot, same as I'd found him. I sat there in the idling truck for probably a full minute before I could make myself drive away. I told a trooper I knew about it a few days later, more to unload it than anything, and he took it seriously enough to ask around. But there wasn't much to go on. No truck matching a breakdown reported anywhere on that stretch that week. No Curtis anybody in town could place. I let it go the way you let go of things that didn't actually hurt you. Filed it under strange and moved on. Though for a couple years after that, I'd catch myself checking the shoulder a little harder whenever I picked somebody up out that way, looking too long at a man's boots to see if they were dressed like somebody who'd really been out in the cold. It stayed just an odd story told. Maybe 3 or 4 times in 20 years, right up until last spring, when I was half listening to the news out of Fairbanks, while I gassed up the truck and heard a name that stopped me cold at the pump. Curtis Boyd, under arrest, connected through DNA to a string of disappearances. Going back to the mid-2000s, women picked up or last seen along the Richardson and Glen Highway corridors. The report mentioned, almost as an aside, that Boyd had spent a stretch of years in the early 2000s working for a fuel delivery outfit that serviced several of the local cab and shuttle companies in the interior. The same companies that kept mileage logs, driver schedules, gas card records, right there in the cab of every truck he filled. I stood there with the nozzle still running gas I didn't need, doing math I didn't want to do. And a few weeks after that, buried further down in a follow-up story, was a name finally attached to a set of remains identified after all those years. A young woman last seen getting into a vehicle near Paxson, matched at last to a family that had been waiting a very long time to stop wondering. I never told the trooper who called me back about that second article that I already knew the name before he said it. I just thanked him for letting me know, and sat in my kitchen a long while after I hung up, thinking about how ordinary that man had looked in my mirror, how easy his voice was, how he'd thanked me for the ride and told me to drive safe, and how the only thing that had ever separated me from becoming part of that same story was a fuel gauge I happened to lie about, and a man who, for whatever reason of his own, decided that night to let me be the one who got to walk away. I've hauled heavy equipment for going on 22 years now, mostly out of Anchorage, mostly up and down the Glen Highway between Palmer and Glen Allen, sometimes further out toward Talk if the job calls for it. In that time, I've slid off the road twice, hit a moose going about 40, and spent one miserable night in a ditch outside Sutton waiting on a tow that took 6 hours, because the tow truck itself got stuck. None of those nights bother me the way this one does. And the strange part is, this is the one where nothing actually went wrong. My truck broke down, a man fixed it, and I drove away just fine. That's the whole story. It's also the only one from all my years on that road that still catches me at 2 in the morning when I can't sleep. This was February of 2013. I was hauling a mini excavator on a lowboy for a job out past Glen Allen, running later than I wanted, because the job had been pushed twice already, and the foreman needed the machine on site by morning, no matter what. Before I left Palmer, I checked the road report the way I always do, and there was nothing on it worth worrying about. Overcast, light snow expected. 20 or so below zero. Nothing. That would have kept me home on a normal week. By the time I got past Sheep Mountain, coming up on Eureka Summit, the snow had turned into something the forecast never mentioned. It wasn't light anymore. It was the kind of whiteout where your own headlights just bounce straight back at you, and the road disappears. 6 feet past the hood. I'd seen bad weather on that pass before. Everybody who drives it has, but I remember thinking it sat wrong, that nothing on the radio or the report had warned me it was coming. I dropped to a crawl, hazards on, trying to keep the white line under my left tire and nothing else. That's when the dash started acting up. Not dying slow, not dimming the way a truck does when a battery's going. The gauges just started jumping, the oil pressure needle bouncing like it was trying to shake itself loose. And then every light on that dash lit up at once for about 2 seconds before the whole engine just quit. No sputtering, no warning. 1 second I had power. The next I was coasting dead in the snow with nothing but whatever was left in the electrical system keeping my headlights on. I got the truck, stopped on what I hoped was still the shoulder, and reached for my CB, because that's the first thing you do out there. You don't have cell signal for close to 60 miles on that stretch. And the CB is what keeps you from being a story somebody tells later. I keyed it up and got nothing. Not static. Not that low hiss you get even off a dead channel. Just nothing. The kind of nothing I didn't have a name for yet. I've had CBs die on me before. They don't fail quiet like that. They fail loud. So I bundled up, grabbed my headlamp and my toolbox, and climbed down into snow already over my boots, wind cutting sideways, hard enough that I had to turn my head just to breathe. I got the hood up and started going through what I knew. Battery terminals, solid. Fuse box, nothing burnt. None of it lined up with what I'd just watched happen on that dash. In 22 years of engines quitting on me, I'd never seen one quit like that. I was standing there going back and forth between the wiring and the manual. I kept behind the seat when I caught movement in my side mirror. On that stretch of road, at that hour, in that kind of storm, you hear a diesel engine coming for a full minute before you ever see it. Sound carries a long way out there because there's nothing to swallow it. I hadn't heard a single engine. No truck, no plow, nothing. But there was a shape in the mirror, standing maybe 10 feet back off my trailer. I turned around expecting to see somebody walking up, another driver who'd pulled in behind me that I'd somehow missed. He wasn't walking. He was already just standing there. Close enough that I could make out he was a big guy, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas work jacket. I hadn't heard boots in the snow, and on that surface, in that quiet, you hear everything. Your own footsteps, your own breathing. I never heard him arrive. I only noticed him once he was already there. The first thing that struck me, even before anything else was that he wasn't dressed for it. No hat, no gloves, just that canvas jacket over what might have been a flannel shirt. At 20 below, with wind on top of it, a man dressed like that should have been in real trouble inside of 10 minutes, shaking, cursing, stamping his feet to keep blood moving. He wasn't doing any of that. He stood there easy, hands loose at his sides like it was a mild evening in October. I tried to catch his breath fogging in my headlight beam the way mine was coming out in thick clouds, and I couldn't find it. I told myself the angle was bad, the light was bad, and I let it go because I needed help a lot more than I needed to chase that thought down. He asked if I'd lost power all at once. No warning. Dash lighting up strange right before it died. I hadn't said a word about any of that. I'd barely gotten out. Truck just died on me before he described exactly what I'd watched happen 30 seconds earlier. I figured maybe he'd seen it from wherever he'd come from, or maybe it was just a common enough failure that he'd guessed right. I was cold and grateful, and not in the mood to question my own luck. He didn't have a toolbox. Didn't ask me for gloves or a jack or anything, except to hold the light steady. He just reached into my open box on the ground and pulled out exactly what he needed. First try, no digging, no asking which socket fit what. I've worked with mechanics who've owned the same toolbox for 10 years and still hunt around in it. He went straight to it like he'd packed it himself. What he found under that hood wasn't small. It turned out to be deep. In the wiring harness, the kind of short that usually means pulling half the dash apart just to trace it. The kind of job that eats an afternoon in a warm shop with good light on it, let alone a wind-blown shoulder at 2 in the morning. I've heard guys talk about jobs like that, taking most of a day. He had his hands in there, maybe 8 minutes. Somewhere in the middle of it, my CB up in the cab crackled to life on its own. Just a burst of somebody's chatter on Channel 19, gone as fast as it came. I turned toward the cab on reflex. 2 seconds, maybe 3. When I turned back, he already had the hood most of the way down, wiping his hands on a rag I hadn't seen him carrying a minute before. I asked him where he'd come from. Since there wasn't another vehicle in sight, and the nearest anything, gas station or lodge, was better than 40 miles either direction. He just said he was around there a lot, and left it at that. I asked if he had a truck parked somewhere I'd missed in the whiteout, and he didn't really answer, just gave a small nod toward the dark like that settled it. I dug for my wallet, told him I wanted to pay him something, because this wasn't a 5-minute favor by any measure I understood. He waved it off and said something I've replayed more times than I can count since. He said, somebody did the same for him once. Out here, and you just do it for the next guy. At the time, it sounded like the kind of thing a decent stranger says on a bad night. It's the out here that gets me now, and the way he said it, like it was a long time ago. I looked down for a second and a half to get a bill out of my wallet, and when I looked back up to hand it to him, he wasn't there. Not walking away, not a shape fading into the snow. The spot where he'd been standing, close enough I could have touched him, was just empty. I spun around, checking both directions down the highway, and on that road, even in bad weather, you can usually pick up a set of taillights or headlights from a good distance. Because there's nothing else out there to block your view. Nothing. No lights moving away either direction. No engine sound fading out. Nothing at all. I grabbed my headlamp and walked the area around the truck, and I found my own boot prints everywhere, deep and clear. Because the snow hadn't been coming down hard enough in the last 20 minutes to fill anything in fast. What I didn't find was a second set. Not by the hood, not approaching, not leaving. Just mine, going in every direction I'd already gone, and nothing else. I climbed back in, shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold anymore. Turned the key, and the engine caught on the first try, smoother than it had run in months. The check engine light that had been coming and going for weeks, the one my regular mechanic back in Palmer couldn't pin down, never came back on for the rest of that truck's life. I drove the rest of the way to Glen Allen, telling myself a handful of normal explanations, one after another. Maybe he was DOT staff doing a check I didn't know about. Maybe he had a vehicle parked far enough off that the whiteout swallowed the lights before I thought to look. Maybe the cold and the adrenaline had messed with how I was remembering the last 10 minutes. I wanted one of those to be true badly enough that I'd almost talked myself into it by the time I hit town. I stopped at the gas station in Glen Allen to warm up and get coffee, and I asked the guy behind the counter if he'd seen any DOT trucks or plows come through recently, figuring I could track the man down and thank him properly. He told me the plows hadn't run that night. Budget cuts had them on a skeleton schedule, and he hadn't seen another rig come through in the last 2 hours, besides mine. I called my dispatcher the next day too, half joking about it, asking if she knew of anybody else working that stretch that night. She checked and told me flat out there was nobody else scheduled on the Glen past Sutton after midnight, not from our outfit or any other one she could find a record of. I let it sit for a long time after that, the way you let go of something you can't do anything with. It came back up almost 3 years later, sitting in a diner outside Palmer with a couple of older drivers who'd been running that road since before I ever got my license. I told it mostly as a joke, the night my truck got fixed by a ghost. One of them, a guy named Earl who'd been driving that highway close to 40 years, didn't laugh. He asked what the man looked like, and when I described him, big through the shoulders, canvas jacket, no hat. In that kind of cold, Earl went quiet for a second. Then he told me about a driver he used to run with, back in the 80s, known up and down that road for always rokes, stopping when somebody broke down. No matter the hour, no matter the weather, who died, one February night, doing exactly that. Pulled over to help a stranded rig near Eureka Summit, and got hit from behind by a truck that never saw him standing in the snow. Earl said the man never wore a hat either. Said it was practically a running joke on the CB back then, and that everybody figured the cold would finally teach him. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for an explanation that isn't sitting right in front of him, and I know coincidence covers a lot of ground if you let it. But I still drive that stretch more nights than not, and every time I pass through there, especially when the weather starts to turn boring, I find myself watching the shoulder a little closer than I used to, half hoping I never need that kind of help again out there, half hoping that if I do, it shows up just the same. I drove the Alaska highway for 6 years before anything happened up there that I couldn't put down to exhaustion. And I think that matters because every driver who runs that road has a story about hearing things after 20 hours awake in a whiteout. I know what exhaustion sounds like. I know what it does to your eyes on the long, straight stretch between Watson Lake and Teslin when the trees start looking like people standing at the tree line. This wasn't that. I want to tell it in the order it happened, because if I just gave you the end, you wouldn't believe the middle. And the middle is the part that still gets me. It was September of 2019. I was running solo for a small outfit out of Dawson Creek, hauling dry freight up to Fairbanks and coming back with whatever backhaul dispatch could scrape together. They'd just put me in a different truck than my usual rig, a 2011 Freightliner with a flat-top sleeper, Unit 114. It had been sitting in the yard a while, they said, waiting on a driver. It ran clean, the shop had gone through it, and I didn't think twice about it. You don't get sentimental about equipment in this business. A truck is a truck until it gives you a reason to think otherwise. The first night out, climbing the grade past Steamboat Mountain, I heard something shift behind my seat, back where the curtain divides the cab from the sleeper. A dull thump once, like a weight settling. I'd just come up off a rough patch of frost heaves, so I chalked it up to my duffel bag sliding off the bunk. Or a loose ratchet strap knocking against the wall. I pulled into the next turnout, climbed back there with my flashlight, and found everything exactly where I'd left it. Bag on the bunk. Nothing on the floor. I remember thinking, well, that's what tired sounds like, and got back in the seat. 2 nights later, I woke up from a nap at a pull-out past Toad River, and my thermos was on the floor of the sleeper, cap off, coffee soaked into the carpet. I always wedge that thermos into the same cubby by the bunk, and I always screw the cap down tight, because I've had it roll before, and I hate cleaning coffee out of that carpet. I told myself the engine vibration must have walked it loose over time, that the cap wasn't as tight as I thought. It's a reasonable thing to tell yourself once. It got harder to tell myself the second thing. I never drive with that curtain closed. I like the light, and I like being able to see straight back through the mirror if I need to. Coming out of a fuel stop in Whitehorse, I climbed back up into the cab, and the curtain was drawn shut, pulled all the way across the track, tucked at the edges the way you'd do it if you wanted to keep light out. I'd been standing at that pump the whole time. Doors locked. Nobody around but me and the kid running the till inside. That was the first night I didn't sleep well. And the first night I started taking a picture of the sleeper before I pulled out of any stop, just to have something to check against. I had a dash cam in that truck, the kind with 2 lenses, one facing out the windshield for insurance purposes and one facing back into the cab, because the company required it after a claim a few years back. After the storage net behind the passenger seat got emptied out and refolded into a pile I hadn't touched, I sat in a gravel lot outside Haines Junction and scrubbed through hours of that interior footage, looking for myself doing it in some kind of half-asleep fog I wouldn't remember. The footage showed nothing, just me driving, same as always, right up until a stretch where the timestamp jumped almost 3 seconds, video going straight from one number to the next, like a skipped frame in a film strip. When it picked back up, the net was already the way I found it. I had a friend who does fleet electronics look at the card later, and he'd said, corrupted files skip like that sometimes, memory card errors, nothing more. I believed him for about a day. It was at Watson Lake, at the fuel island by the Sign Forest, that an older driver walked past Unit 114 and stopped. He read the door decal, looked at the plate, and asked who was running that truck now. I told him I was. He got quiet, in a way that didn't match the question. And then he said, half to himself, "That's Corinne's old truck, isn't it?" Before catching my face and backing off it fast, telling me to forget he said anything, that he was thinking of a different unit. I didn't know any Corinne. I didn't push it right then, because you learn not to push things with strangers at a truck stop. But I carried that name with me the rest of the run like a stone in my boot. I asked the shop foreman about it when I brought the truck in for an oil change in Whitehorse, framing it like idle curiosity. He didn't dodge it the way the old driver had. He told me straight that Corinne had been the regular driver on that unit until about 1.5 years before I got it, and that she'd gone missing on this same stretch of highway during an early whiteout near Destruction Bay. Truck had gotten stuck in a drift, and near as anyone could piece together, she'd left it on foot, trying to reach a highway maintenance camp a few miles up, in weather that dropped visibility to nothing. They searched for weeks. They never found her. The truck sat in a yard for over 1 year before anyone put a driver back in it, and he said that plainly, like it was just a fact of the business, not a warning. I did a full search of that sleeper after that, telling myself I was being practical, checking for mice for a stowaway, for anything with a mundane explanation. Behind the padding on the wall by the bunk, tucked where a panel had come loose and been screwed back down, I found a laminated photo of a woman with 2 kids at what looked like a fairground, and a ball cap with a trucking company patch that wasn't ours, sweat-stained at the band. I didn't need anyone to tell me whose they were. Finding them didn't scare me the way I expected. It made the whole thing feel less like a story and more like a person. And that was worse. I took the truck into a shop in Fairbanks a week later, telling them I had a rattle in the sleeper wall I couldn't place. They pulled the interior panels, checked behind the insulation, looked for any sign of a gap big enough for something to be living back there, rodents, anything. Structurally, the truck was fine, but the mechanic mentioned, almost as an aside, while he was buttoning the panels back up, that there was a cold pocket of air right by the bunk with no vent or gap anywhere near it to explain the draft, and some scratching on the inside of one panel that didn't match any tool marks he recognized. He shrugged it off as just an old truck settling in its bones. I noticed he didn't want to keep his hand in that gap any longer than he had to. Around then, I started doubting myself in a different direction. I'd been running tight hours that month, stacking loads back to back to cover a slow season, and I know what fatigue does to a person's memory. There's a thing that happens to drivers on long, isolated hauls, micro-sleeps, short blackout, where you're technically awake and moving, but not laying down memory. And I started wondering if I was the one disturbing things in some half-conscious state and simply not remembering it. I didn't tell dispatch. You tell dispatch something like that, you get pulled off the road for a fitness evaluation, and I needed the miles. So I decided to prove it to myself instead, one way or the other. At a truck stop outside Talk, I ran a strip of masking tape across the curtain track and stretched a single thread across the sleeper floor, low enough that I'd have to step over it to reach the bunk. And I dusted a thin layer of baby powder across the carpet back there to catch any footprint, mine or otherwise. Then I drove a long, clean stretch toward Delta Junction while I stayed on the radio the entire time with another driver heading the same direction, trading mile markers back and forth so there'd be no gap where I could claim I didn't remember. When I pulled over and checked, the thread was snapped, and lying to one side, the tape was peeled back from the track, and there was a long smear dragged clean through the powder with no shoe pattern in it at all. Nothing that matched a boot or a sock or bare skin. Whatever had gone back there hadn't walked on the floor the way a person walks. After that, the disturbances stopped being about objects and started being about presence. I'd glance in the mirror and see the pillow on the bunk holding a clear dent, the shape you'd get from a head resting on it seconds before. And then it would ease back flat while I was still looking. Twice, parked overnight at a pullout with the engine off, I felt the whole cab rock on its springs, the specific give-you feel when someone shifts their weight in the back of the sleeper, and both times I was up and back there with my flashlight inside of 5 seconds. And both times there was nothing, no one, not even warmth where a body would have been. Somewhere past Cluane Lake, in weather that had turned early and mean, ice fog rolling low across the road, and the temperature dropping fast, I caught myself checking that mirror instead of the road, chasing a shifting sound I couldn't place, and in the half-second I looked away. The front tires caught a slick patch, and the whole rig started drifting toward the center line, with a loaded truck coming the other way. I hauled it back with everything I had, felt the trailer fishtail once and catch, and sat there afterward with my hands shaking on the wheel, not from the mystery anymore, but from how close I'd come to dying because of it. That was the moment I stopped treating this as something to solve and started treating it as something to survive until I could get out of that truck. The last thing happened on the stretch coming down toward Beaver Creek, close enough to the border that I could see the customs building lights in the distance. I checked the mirror, and my thermos was sitting up front in the cup holder, where it belonged, cap on, same as I'd left it that morning. A pickup was pissing slow in the oncoming lane, and I gave it my full attention for maybe 2-3 seconds, no more. When I looked back, the thermos was gone from the cup holder and sitting in the cubby by the bunk instead. Cap screwed down tight, tucked into the exact spot I always used, except turned facing the way I never turn it. There had been no time. No one had been in that cab. I didn't find out until later, from the same shop foreman, that Corinne used to keep her thermos wedged into that same cubby, facing that same direction, a habit. 2 other drivers who'd known her both confirmed, without me ever describing it to them first. I hadn't known that detail existed to be copied. I finished that run into Fairbanks and dropped the trailer, and I didn't sleep in that sleeper again. I bunked in motels the rest of that trip, on my own dime, and told dispatch I had a mechanical issue I was chasing. As soon as I got back to Dalton Creek, I started making calls to sell Unit 114 outright, and the company was happy enough to let it go, since I asked for less than it was worth, and nobody argued with me about it. A guy in his 20s bought it 2 weeks later, excited about the price, talking about how he was finally getting his own authority, asking me what the truck was like to drive. I told him it ran clean, that the shop kept good records, that the sleeper was in solid shape. All of that was true. I stood in the yard and watched him pull out onto the highway with it, and I never said Corinne's name to him, never mentioned the cubby or the curtain or the cold spot behind that panel. I've turned that decision over more times than I can count. Whether I owed him the truth, or whether the truth wouldn't have done anything but scare a young Jai out of a truck he needed for his business. I never got an answer that satisfied me either way. I just know I sold it. And I let him drive off not knowing, the same way somebody once let me climb into that cab, not knowing a thing about it either. In the summer of 2004, I drove a lab courier route on the Seward Highway for a hospital contract out of Anchorage. And I want to say up front that I'm not a person who sees things that aren't there. I balanced my own checkbook by hand. I double-checked specimen labels 3 times before I'd hand a cooler to the tech at the dock. I tell you that because what happened to me on that road isn't something I felt or sensed or had a bad feeling about. It's something that got written down on paper by other people before I ever said a word to anyone. That's just the part that still gets me. Not the memory, the paperwork. The route was simple. I picked up sealed specimen coolers from a small clinic in Girdwood twice a day and drove them up the Seward Highway into Anchorage, along Turnagain Arm, past Bird Point, past the pullout where tourists stop to watch the boar tide come in, past the Indian turnoff, into the hospital loading dock. 40 minutes, give or take, if the tour buses weren't backed up. I'd done that same stretch of road, at that point, somewhere north of 1,100 times. I could have told you which curve had the pothole that never got patched, and which guardrail was dented from some accident before my time. That road was as familiar to me as my own kitchen. The day I want to tell you about was a Tuesday in July. Clear sky, maybe 70 degrees, no wind to speak of. Nothing about the morning gave me any reason to remember it specifically, which is exactly why I remember it now. I loaded the cooler at the clinic a little after 2, called in on the radio the way I did every single trip. Deb, leaving Girdwood, usual ETA, and the dispatcher, a guy named Lou, who had been doing that job longer than I'd been driving, said, "Copy that back," same as he had 1,000 times before. I pulled onto the highway at 2:11. I know that because it's the first hard number in this whole story, and it's not from my memory. It's from Lou's log. The next thing I have any real memory of is pulling into the hospital dock and glancing at my dashboard clock the way I autopilot, not even really looking, just checking my time against a number I already expected to see. I expected somewhere around 2:50. What the clock said was 6:26. My first thought, and I mean genuinely my first thought, was that the clock had reset itself, the way car clocks sometimes do after you disconnect a battery. I sat there for a second, doing that stupid mental math you do when a number doesn't make sense, like maybe I was misreading it, maybe it said 226 and I'd flipped a digit in my head. It didn't say 226. I checked it twice. Then, out of habit more than suspicion, I looked at my wristwatch. I want to be clear that this was not a digital watch tied to any car battery or dashboard electronics. It was a plain analog watch my husband had given me 2 Christmases before, wound by hand. It said 6:24, 2 minutes off the dash clock, which is about what you'd expect from 2 separate timepieces that hadn't been synced in a while. 2 independent instruments, no shared wiring, no shared power source, agreeing with each other almost to the minute. That's the moment the ground moved a little under me, because a broken clock is an easy thing to dismiss, and 2 clocks agreeing on the wrong time is not. I tried to walk myself backward through the drive, the way you'd retrace your steps looking for keys, and that's when the second thing happened, which honestly scared me worse than the clocks did. I couldn't find the drive. I don't mean it was fuzzy or dreamlike. I mean, I reached for it and there was almost nothing there to grab. I remembered pulling onto the highway. I remembered very clearly the dock lights at the hospital coming into view through my windshield. In between those 2 things, there should have been 40 minutes of a road I'd driven 1,100 times, and instead, there was maybe 10 seconds of nothing in particular, the kind of blank you get when someone asks what you had for lunch on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago. Except this wasn't 3 weeks ago. This was minutes. I went inside and called dispatch from the dock phone, mostly because I felt like I owed Lou an explanation for being so late, and I remember apologizing before he'd even said hello, telling him I didn't know what had happened. Maybe I'd pulled over and fallen asleep. I was so sorry. Lou didn't sound annoyed. He sounded confused in a specific way, the way people sound when the thing you're telling them doesn't match something they're looking at. He said, "Hang on," and I heard him flipping through the call logbook we all had to sign off in by hand for chain of custody reasons, specimen transport being what it was, and he read my checkout time back to me, 2:11. Then he read my check-in time, which the dock guard had logged the second I badged through, because that's how the system worked. No exceptions. Not for me, not for anybody. 6:31. He did the subtraction out loud, slower than he needed to, like he wanted to hear himself say it wrong. 4 hours and 20 minutes. He asked me, not unkindly, if my car had broken down somewhere and I'd had to walk for help. I told him no, the car ran fine. It was running fine right now, parked 20 feet from where I was standing. That's when I went back out to the car and started looking for anything that would explain it in a way I could live with. Jackson. I checked the trip odometer, which I zeroed at the clinic every single morning as part of the mileage log the contract required. It read 38. 4 miles. The direct route from that clinic to that dock was 38. 2 to 38. 6, depending on which lane you were in through the one stretch with construction cones. Whatever had happened to me, I had not gotten lost. I had not taken a wrong turn, backtracked, driven in circles, looking for a way out. The distance was exactly what 40 minutes of normal driving would put on the odometer. So somewhere in those 4 hours, I had covered 40 minutes worth of road and nothing more. Which meant either I'd been parked somewhere for the other 3 hours and 40 minutes, or the extra time hadn't happened to the car at all. I checked the gas gauge next, mostly out of habit, and it matched too. No extra idling, no extra miles, nothing a mechanic could point to. I stood there next to the open driver's door for a minute, just trying to feel normal again, and that's when I noticed my hands. They were cold. Not cold like you get from air conditioning, cold like you get from standing outside in February without gloves. The kind of cold that makes your knuckles ache. It was 70 degrees out. I'd been sitting in a car with the windows up the whole time, presumably, and my hands felt like I'd been holding ice. My back and my hips were stiff too, in that specific way you get after sitting still in one position far too long. The kind of stiff you get on a long flight, not from 40 minutes behind a wheel. I leaned back into the car to check the heater controls, thinking maybe I'd had it cranked and forgotten. And that's when I saw the windshield. On the inside, low along the bottom edge where the glass meets the dash, there was frost. Actual frost. The fern pattern kind you get on a car window in January. Not fog, not condensation you could wipe away with your sleeve. I put my finger against it, and it was cold and wet under my fingertip, and it melted where I touched it, the way real frost does, not the way a smudge does. I sat there with my hand against that spot for longer than I probably should have, in the middle of July, on a warm afternoon, trying to understand how the inside of my windshield had frozen while the outside temperature never dropped below 60 that whole day, and I couldn't get anywhere with it. I still can't. I didn't say anything about any of that when I carried the cooler in. I was too rattled to volunteer information I didn't understand myself. But the tech on duty that afternoon, a woman named Priya, who'd checked in my coolers, probably 400 times by then, looked at me before I said a word and asked if I was feeling all right, because apparently I looked, in her words, like I'd been sick. I told her I was fine. She didn't push it, but she pulled the specimen log and read off the internal cooler thermometer strip before she signed off on the batch, same as always. And it came back within the normal range for a transit time of roughly 40 minutes. Not 4 hours and 20 minutes. 40 minutes. If that cooler had genuinely spent over 4 hours sitting in a warm car in July, the samples inside would have been compromised and the paperwork would have shown it. It didn't. Whatever had happened to that missed time, it hadn't happened to the blood in the back seat. I didn't tell my husband the whole truth that night. I told him I'd gotten stuck behind a wreck. It wasn't until about 3 weeks later, when I started getting headaches on the right side of my head, sharp enough that I finally went in to see our family doctor, that anything else surfaced. I mentioned the headaches and a faint ringing that came and went in one ear, And while he was checking my ears with the otoscope, he paused and asked, in a pretty neutral voice, how long I'd had the marks behind my ears. I told him I didn't have any marks behind my ears. He had me look in a hand mirror. There were 2 small marks, one behind each ear, almost symmetrical, not quite burns and not quite bruises, already fading. He asked if I'd had any recent dental work, any new jewelry, any allergic reaction. I told him no to all of it. He wrote it down as unexplained dermatitis and moved on, because that's what you do with something you can't otherwise categorize. But I remember sitting in that exam room, doing the math on the calendar in my head, and coming up with 3 weeks, which put it right around that Tuesday. I didn't go looking for anyone else's version of this for a long time, honestly. I think some part of me didn't want to find one. But about a year later, at a retirement dinner for one of the older drivers, I ended up talking to a long-haul trucker named Frank who'd run freight up and down that same corridor for close to 30 years. And I don't even remember exactly how it came up. But I asked him, half joking, if he'd ever lost track of time out there. He didn't laugh. He got quiet. The kind of quiet where you can watch someone decide whether to actually answer you. And then he told me that sometime in the late 80s, on almost that exact stretch, near the Indian turnoff, he'd lost close to 3 hours he never accounted for, and it had scared him enough that he never told his dispatcher, never told his wife, just started leaving earlier on that run for the rest of his career, and never asked why. He asked me not to repeat his name if I ever told anybody, and until now, I never have. That conversation is what finally sent me digging. Quietly, through a friend of mine who worked records for the state troopers post out that way, I asked her, off the record, if there'd been any unusual calls logged for that stretch of highway on that particular date. She came back a couple weeks later, a little annoyed with me for asking, and said there was an entry from that evening with no case number attached and no follow-up report on file, just a timestamp and a location flag and the word unfounded written next to it, which apparently meant somebody had called something in and nobody had ever closed it out with an explanation. She wouldn't tell me what the original call was about, either because she didn't know or because she didn't want to. A few months after that, I drove out on a Saturday by myself, no cooler in the back, no schedule to keep, just to see if anything happened again. Nothing did on the way there. On the way back, right around the same pullout by Bird Point, my truck radio dropped into static for maybe 4 or 5 seconds. Clean static, no stations bleeding through. And both my hands went tingly up to the wrist, the way a limb feels when you've slept on it wrong. It stopped as fast as it started. I drove that same 50 yards 3 more times that afternoon, slow, windows down, just to see, and it happened every single time, right at that spot, never anywhere else on the route. I never told anyone I did that except my husband, and even he didn't quite know what to do with it. The last piece I have, and it's a small one, came from an old acquaintance who used to fly small planes for a fishing outfit out of Girdwood. Years later, at a barbecue, we got to talking about strange weather days, and he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd once had his compass and one of his gauges go haywire for a few minutes on a flight over Turnagain Arm sometime in the summer of 2004. No explanation, no repeat of it before or since, gone by the time he leveled out. I asked him if he remembered the date. He didn't, not exactly, just that it was summer, and it had bothered him enough that he'd written it in his flight log, which he still had. He never showed it to me. I never pushed him to. I still drive that road. I did it for another 11 years after that Tuesday. right up until I retired from that job. And I drive it now, sometimes just because it's the way into Anchorage. I've never once gotten an answer that explains the clocks, or the frost, or the marks behind my ears, or the cooler thermometer, or any of it. And I've stopped expecting one. What I do instead, and I've done it every single time since, without fail, is leave earlier than I need to. An hour earlier, sometimes more. I don't drive it after the sun starts dropping if I can help it. And every time I pass that spot near Bird Point, I still find myself glancing down at the clock, just to check. Even now, all these years later, half expecting it to say something it shouldn't. I've been highway since I was 19 years old, hauling parts and fuel drums and camp supplies out to the mining operations past Central. And I still keep paper maps folded up under my seat even now, 'cause I don't trust a screen to tell me the truth about the road the way my own eyes do. What happened to me out there in the fall of 1987 is the only thing in almost 40 years of driving that I still think about on nights I can't sleep. And it's not because of anything I saw. It's because of what the numbers told me 2 days later, sitting at my own kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold. That night I was running late coming back from Central, hauling an empty flatbed after dropping a load of pump parts at one of the placer camps. The sky had already gone that flat gray-black it gets in October up there, and a little snow was starting to spit against the windshield. Nothing serious, just enough to make the gravel shine in the headlights. I'd made that drive probably 400 times by then. I knew every frost heave, every washboard stretch, every place the road dipped down toward a creek crossing. So when I came around a bend somewhere past the old airstrip and saw a turnoff cut into the trees on my right, gravel bed and all, I actually slowed down out of pure surprise, because there had never been a road there, not once, not in 10 years of running that exact stretch twice a week. I sat there with my foot, easing off the gas, looking at it, and my first thought wasn't fear. It was almost insult, like the road had lied to me somehow. I figured the mining company or the borough had cut a new access road over the summer while I'd been running a different route for a few months, and I hadn't caught wind of it yet, which happens sometimes out there. It looked like it cut back toward the highway further down, maybe saving me 4 or 5 miles and a long ridge climb. And since I was already running behind and wanted to get home before the roads glazed over, I turned onto it without thinking twice. The gravel under my tires felt fresh, almost too fresh, packed smooth without a single washboard ripple, which should have told me something right there, because a road doesn't get smooth like that until it's been driven for a season or two. And a brand new cut is always rough, full of loose rock that hasn't settled. I didn't clock it at the time. I just remember thinking, somebody did a nice job on this one, and kept driving. The first few minutes felt completely normal, spruce on both sides, the kind of dark that swallows your headlights 10 feet out, the same sound my tires always made on that gravel. But after what felt like 5 or 6 minutes, I started watching for the little creek crossing that road should have hit if it was cutting back toward the highway the way I figured, and it didn't come. I kept driving, telling myself the curve was just wider than I'd guessed, and then I watched for the ridgeline to open up on my left, which always happens along that stretch, no matter which road you're on out there. And that didn't come either. It was just trees, the same distance apart, the same dark, for longer than any shortcut through that country has any business being. That's when I pulled over, put it in park, left the engine running for the heat, and dug my map out from under the seat, one of the old fold-out state highway maps I always kept. I traced my finger along the line of the Steese from Central toward Circle, looking for any side road, any dotted line, any hint of a cutoff in that section. And there was nothing, not even an unmarked trail. I remember sitting there with the dome light on, feeling my neck get warm the way it does when you're annoyed at yourself more than scared. Thinking the map printers had just never bothered updating a back road nobody official cared about. Because that used to happen more than you'd think. I got back on the road and drove another stretch. And eventually, finally, the gravel widened out and dumped me back onto the Steese highway proper. And I recognized the spot right away, a bend with a rock cut on the uphill side that I'd passed 1,000 times. Except it wasn't where I expected. Based on how long I'd been driving that side road, I should have popped out several miles closer to Central than I actually was. Instead, I came out much farther down, closer to Circle than made any sense for the amount of time I'd spent on that stretch. I remember frowning at that for a second, then just shrugging it off, chalking up to me losing track of time while I was looking for landmarks that weren't there. I finished the drive home, backed the truck into the yard, and did what I always did, no matter how tired I was, which was fill out my logbook before I went inside, because that was drilled into me by the man who trained me, and I never broke the habit. I wrote down my times, my mileage, didn't think a thing more about it, and went to bed. It would have stayed just a strange little memory if I hadn't mentioned it about 3 weeks later to a fella named Dale who ran maintenance for the borough on that section of highway. We were standing around a wood stove at the depot, and I brought it up as basically nothing, just making conversation. Said something like, "That shortcut somebody cut in past the airstrip saved me a few miles the other week." Dale looked at me like I'd told him I saw a moose doing math. He said there was no road work authorized anywhere on that stretch. That whole year, no survey stakes, no permits filed, nothing. And he'd know because he drove that greater route personally every other week. I laughed it off at the time, told him I must have the location wrong, but it sat with me wrong the rest of that day. So the next weekend, in full daylight, clear sky, nothing hiding anything from me, I drove that same stretch slow, mile marker by mile marker, looking for that turnoff, and it wasn't there. Not just closed off, not just grown over, not there at all. No gap in the tree line, no cut stumps, no gravel bed poking through the brush. Nothing that would even suggest a road had ever touched that ground. I got out and walked the shoulder for a good quarter mile, in both directions, kicking through the frost-killed grass, and there was nothing but undisturbed black spruce standing exactly the way it had probably stood for 80 years. That should have been the end of it, a strange story I'd tell at the depot for a few months and then forget. Except I couldn't let it go, so I actually drove into Fairbanks and asked around at the Borough Road office, and later even called a contact at the state DOT district office, and both of them told me the same thing Dale had. No project on record, no easement, no survey. As far as any government paper was concerned, that stretch of ground had never had so much as a footpath cut through it in living memory. I started doing what a man does when he doesn't want to believe something impossible, which is try to talk himself into a boring explanation. Maybe I'd misjudged where I turned off. Maybe it was actually some old mining spur, a mile or two up or down that I was misremembering. But then I thought about it longer, driving it over and over in my head, and I remembered something specific I'd passed about why down that road a rusted piece of dredge equipment sitting off in the brush on the left side, an old bucket line tooth, big as a wash tub, half swallowed by moss. I knew exactly where that piece of equipment was because I'd seen it before years earlier, but only ever from the highway side, from a totally different angle, on a totally different road, miles from where I'd been driving that night. There was no way to explain seeing that same landmark from a road that didn't exist unless the road really had been there, right where I remembered it for those few minutes. It was around then that I went back and pulled my logbook out of the drawer where I kept the old ones, found the page from that night, and just sat there looking at my own handwriting. I'd written down my departure time from the camp near Central and my arrival time back at the yard, same as I did every night. And when I actually sat down and worked the math against the mileage I'd logged, neither number made sense. If I'd taken the regular highway the whole way, the time I'd logged was too long by almost an hour. But if I accounted for the shortcut actually saving me distance the way it felt like it had, the time should have been shorter, not longer. Either way I ran it, the clock didn't match the road. So I did what I guess only a man who's spent his whole life keeping fuel logs would think to do, and I worked out the mileage against what I knew that truck burned per gallon, because I remembered exactly how much fuel was in that tank when I left Central, and I hadn't stopped anywhere the whole way home. When I ran the numbers, the fuel burned matched almost exactly what it should have for the highway mileage alone. The regular route, no shortcut at all, like the shorter road, had cost me no fuel whatsoever, despite the engine running the whole time I was on it. But the clock said I'd been out there longer than even the long way should have taken. Somewhere in that stretch, there was close to an hour and a half that didn't belong to any mileage I could account for. Gas I didn't burn, road I couldn't find, time that had simply gone somewhere without taking any distance along with it. I never told anybody that part, not even Dale, because saying it out loud made it sound like I was losing my mind. A grown man arguing with his own logbook. I just kept driving, kept hauling freight, kept using that same road every week for years afterward. But I never once drove that stretch after dark again if I had any say in the schedule. If a run was going to put me past that airstrip near dusk, I'd find a reason to leave earlier or push it to morning or questioned, and nobody ever questioned it because everybody up there understood a man having his own rules about certain stretches of road. It wasn't until years later, long after I'd left that hauling job, that another old driver, a man named Roy who'd worked a different route out toward Eagle Summit around that same fall, mentioned almost in passing that he'd lost track of an evening out there once too. Came home later than his own log made sense for. No good reason why, and he'd never spoken of it to anyone because he figured people would think he'd just fallen asleep at the wheel and lost the time that way. We looked at each other for a second when he said it, and neither one of us pushed the conversation any further, because I think we both understood we weren't going to get an answer sitting in that diner. And some things you carry instead of solve. I still have that logbook. I keep it in the same box as the others, all the way back to when I started driving. And every once in a while, usually on a night I can't sleep, I'll take it out and look at that one page again, that one night's entry. And I'll notice something I never paid attention to for years, which is that my own handwriting on that page looks different than every entry around it. Pressed harder into the paper, the letters a little tighter together, like it was written by a man whose hand wasn't quite as steady as it should have been for someone just finishing an ordinary drive home. I don't have an explanation for that road, and after almost 40 years, I've stopped looking for one. But I still keep my maps folded up under the seat. And I still won't drive that stretch of the Steese after the sun goes down. Not because of anything I ever saw out there in the trees, but because of what the numbers told me once I was finally home, safe, sitting still, with nothing left to do but add it all up. I started driving the Talk Cutoff by myself in the fall of 2023, my first season without a trainer in the cab. And I want to tell you about the one run I still can't explain, because 6 months later I still don't have an answer, and neither does anyone else who's looked into it. If you've ever driven long haul at night, especially somewhere with no towns, no lights, and nobody behind you for 100 miles, you already know the kind of quiet I'm talking about. It's not peaceful. It gets loud in its own way, because your own thoughts start filling in the space where other sounds should be. For those who don't know the road, the cutoff runs about 125 miles between Talk and Glenallen. And there is nothing out there. No gas stations, no cell towers, no houses with porch lights. Just black spruce packed tight on both sides. The Alaska range somewhere off in the dark if the clouds ever lift enough to show it. And mile markers that pass so slow at night, you start reading them out loud just to hear a voice, even your own. My rig was a 10-year-old Kenworth with a heater that took forever to catch up to the cold, a thermos of coffee going lukewarm in the cup holder, and a CB radio bolted under the dash that was older than I was. The only real company you have out there is Channel 19. And even that's thin most nights. 1 or 2 truckers bouncing signal off the mountains from 30 or 40 miles out, trading weather and road conditions and nothing else, because that's the code. You don't get personal on the radio. You barely use first names, let alone real ones. Everybody runs a handle, and the whole unspoken point of the handle is that the road doesn't get to know who you actually are. Mine was Ptarmigan. My trainer gave it to me my first week out, and it just stuck. Before I get into what happened, I want to mention something I'd heard back at the yard in Talk, months before any of this, because it matters later. One of the older drivers, a guy named Hutch, who had been running that corridor since before I had my license, told me once during orientation that he didn't run the cutoff after dark anymore, hadn't in years. When somebody asked why, half joking, he just shrugged and said some roads get used to you, and left it right there without explaining. Everybody laughed about it at the time, me included. It sounded like the kind of thing older truckers say to spook the new ones. I filed it away as nothing. I want you to hold on to it too, because I did not think about that sentence again until I very much needed to. That night, I was hauling a load down toward Glenallen, empty trailer, scheduled for the run back the next morning. Nothing unusual about the freight itself. It was early October. First hard snow of the season had come through 2 days before and left the shoulders packed white and crusted, and it was already full dark by 6, because that's how fast the daylight drops off up there once fall turns. I keyed up around mile marker 60-something just to do a routine radio check, more out of habit than actual need, and got nothing back. Not static, not a stray voice, bouncing off the range from somewhere far out, nothing at all. Channel 19 was dead in a way. I hadn't heard it dead before, and I remember thinking that alone was strange enough to mention to my dispatcher the next morning, before anything else happened. I want you to think about that for a second, because it's easy to miss on a first listen. The silence came first. Whatever this was, it cleared the channel before it ever said a word to me. About 20 minutes later, somewhere past the Mentasta turnoff, a voice came through clear, as if it were sitting in the seat right next to me, and it said my name. Not Ptarmigan, my actual name, Callie. My first reaction, and I think this would be most people's first reaction, was to laugh it off, because I figured one of the guys from the yard had gotten hold of my info and was messing with me the way they mess with every new driver at some point in their first season. I keyed back and said something like, "Real funny. Who told you that?" And I sat there waiting for one of the yard voices to come back laughing at me. Instead, the voice just kept going, easy and unbothered, and it described my rig. Not in some vague way you'd guess about any truck on that route. It named the trailer number, stenciled on the back doors, mentioned the long crack running down my driver's side mirror housing, that I'd been meaning to get fixed for 2 months, said it like it was just making small talk. I told myself that was still explainable. Maybe someone had passed me back in talk, gotten a good look, and was repeating it back for a laugh. So I did what you do when you think someone's messing with you on the radio. I started scanning down through the channels to catch whoever was behind this, figuring I'd hear the yard boys somewhere, laughing between themselves at my expense. There was nothing. Not a single carrier wave. Not even the faint hiss you usually pick up bleeding in off a weather service repeater. 40 miles out, the entire band was as dead as I had ever heard it. Every channel. Like the radio had gone somewhere I couldn't follow it. I went back to 19, and the voice was still there, waiting, almost like it knew I'd come back to it. And that's when it said something that put a cold feeling straight through my chest, because it mentioned the photo taped to my visor, the one of my mom that nobody sees unless they're sitting in my exact seat, looking up at exactly that angle. No trucker passing me on a dark highway gets a look at the inside of my visor. That's the detail I couldn't explain away, no matter how many times I ran it back through my head afterward, looking for a normal answer. I grabbed the mic and tried raising dispatch on the company channel, just to hear a voice that made sense. Somebody who could tell me one of the guys had a scanner, or a lucky guess, or anything at all. Nothing came back. Not silence exactly. More like the call went out and never landed anywhere. No click. No static tail at the end. Like I was talking into a room with the door already shut. I tried 3 times and gave up. If you've ever needed to hear a familiar voice and gotten nothing back, you know how much worse that particular kind of quiet feels than regular silence. The voice kept talking through all of it, patient, almost friendly, and then it said a name that had nothing to do with trucking or the yard or anybody I would have mentioned to a single soul out here. It said my sister's name, and then a nickname for her that only my family ever used, one I hadn't said out loud since I left home for this job. That's the part where the novelty completely left me. That's the part where I stopped thinking prank and started doing math on exactly how far I was from another human being who could help me. I checked my mirrors. I flipped my high beams and watched the road behind me stretch back into nothing. No headlights, no taillights, no glow of another rig, catching the tree line the way you can usually see it from miles off out there. Ahead of me was the same emptiness. I was, as far as any human eye could confirm, completely alone on 100 miles of highway. And something on my radio knew my sister's childhood nickname. I keep asking myself what I would have done differently in that seat, and honestly, I still don't have an answer. Would you have pulled over? Kept driving? I did both, and neither one felt right. That's when Hutch's sentence came back to me out of nowhere, sitting there in the cab with my hands too tight on the wheel. Some roads get used to you. I'd laughed at that in the yard. I wasn't laughing at it anymore. And some part of me started wondering how many other drivers on that stretch had a version of this same story sitting quiet in the back of their head, never told out loud because who's going to believe it? I tried to get away from it the practical way. I ran the dial off 19 entirely, over to a channel nobody on that stretch would ever touch, thinking if this was some kind of powerful signals bleeding through, at least a different frequency, might buy me a few minutes of quiet to think. The voice was there within a few seconds, same even tone, like it had simply followed me over without any effort at all, and that was the moment I understood. This had nothing to do with a channel, a frequency, or a radio. Somewhere around there, I noticed something worse than anything it had said outright. I'd think something just in my own head, half a thought about how much farther to the next marker. And the voice would answer it before I ever keyed the mic, sometimes before I'd even finished forming the thought myself. I tested it twice, on purpose, thinking of something specific and waiting to see if it would answer. It did, both times. I stopped testing after that, because I didn't want to find out how far that actually went. Then, it told me something about the road itself. Said there was ice building on the bridge deck 2 miles up. Told me to feather my brakes early rather than late. I did exactly that, because at that point, I was not in a position to ignore anything it said. And when I hit that bridge doing maybe 2 under my usual speed, the trailer still gave long, slow drift across the deck that I felt travel through the whole frame of the truck. Without that warning, I would have taken it faster. And on that kind of black ice, faster is how you end up in the trees. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. It made everything worse. Because now I genuinely didn't know if I was being hunted or being looked after, and not knowing which one is its own particular kind of fear, one that doesn't let you settle on a single emotion to hold on to. I pulled onto the next wide shoulder I found, hazards on, engines still running, and got out into the cold with a flashlight to check my own antenna and cable, some part of me hoping for a short, a chewed wire, anything mechanical I could point to later and laugh about. My breath was coming out in thick clouds, and my hands were shaking hard enough that I dropped the flashlight once in the snow. The cable was fine. Everything was fine. I even, in one stupid reflexive second, pulled the coax loose from the radio housing, completely disconnecting it, and the voice kept coming through the speaker anyway, still talking, still calm, like it hadn't noticed I'd touched anything at all. By then its tone had changed, or maybe I had. It didn't feel like it wanted to hurt me anymore, if it ever had. It felt like it was keeping me company the way you'd keep an animal calm in a small space. Gentle, and even, and never once raising itself, and that gentleness is what finally broke something loose in my memory, because it said one more thing before the end. Something about a name I hadn't heard spoken since I was 7 years old. My grandfather's name. The one who died before I was old enough to really remember his actual voice. It said that name the way you'd say a name you missed. The lights of Glen Allen started showing low against the clouds a few minutes after that. That orange smear a town throws up in the sky before you ever see a single building. And the voice's tone shifted one more time, softer, almost like it was wrapping something up before I got somewhere it couldn't follow. It said something close to see you out here again sometime, Callie, and then, right as my phone buzzed back to life on the dash with a single bar of signal for the first time, in 2 hours, the radio cut to flat static mid-word and never came back. Not that night. and not on any run since. I called my dispatcher the next morning, before I'd even had coffee, and asked her straight out if anybody had been running that stretch behind me. If maybe somebody's radio had bled onto our frequency by accident. She pulled the logs while I sat there, holding the phone with a hand that still wasn't fully steady. Nobody else had a truck on the cutoff that night in either direction, not from our outfit, not from the two other companies that run that corridor. The automated repeater log, the one that catches carrier activity even without recorded audio, showed nothing keyed up on channel 19 for the full 2 hours I was out there. As far as any record exists, I was talking to dead air the entire time. There's one more thing I never put in the report, and I'm only saying it now. Right before the static took over completely, underneath the last thing it said there was a second sound layered behind it for maybe half a second. Something that could have been another voice, or could have just been the radio dying the way old radios do. I've never been able to decide which, and I don't know that I want to. I still run that stretch. I don't have a choice. It's the job. But I've never once, not one single time since, gotten channel 19 to go quiet like that again, no matter how late I'm out there or how bad the weather gets. Some nights I catch myself almost hoping it would happen again, just so I'd finally know whether it was ever really gone in the first place, or just waiting for the next driver dumb enough to run that road alone in the dark. If any of you have ever had a stretch of highway do something to you that you couldn't explain afterward, I'd genuinely like to know I'm not the only one, because right now, I still am, as far as I know. I hunted this country for 22 years before I put my rifles in the safe for good, and I want to say up front, I used to be the guy rolling his eyes at somebody else's story around a campfire. I've told people their cougar was a house cat, and their wolf howl was a husky 2 properties over. I say that because I need you to understand I wasn't a nervous person out there. I knew moose. I knew bear. I could tell you a black bear from a grizzly at 300 yards, just by the way its shoulder hump did or didn't sit above the spine. That's the only reason this story is worth telling. I didn't get scared because I didn't know what I was looking at. I got scared because I did know, piece by piece, exactly what it wasn't, and by the end, there was nothing left in that column to explain it. This was September of 2015. Late in the month, right in the middle of the rut, which matters, because bull moose get bold and stupid that time of year, and you see them everywhere, right up against the highway, practically daring your truck to hit them. I was driving back from a buddy's place outside Healy, heading south on the park's highway, that stretch where the black spruce and willow flats run right up to the shoulder. And there's maybe one pullout every few miles. Full dark, somewhere around 9:30, clear and cold enough that frost was already starting to feather up on the guardrails. About midway through that stretch, I caught movement off the right shoulder in my headlights, and my first red, instant, no thought behind it, was bull moose. Wrong think to be casual about out there. They kill people every year just standing in the road. So I eased off the gas and started my normal routine. Checking speed, checking for a second animal, because they don't always travel alone that time of year. That's when the first thing landed wrong. It was still coming out of the tree line, still moving, and a moose crossing brush at that hour has a very particular rhythm to it. This rolling, top-heavy shuffle because their legs are stupid long and the body kind of swings behind the shoulders as they go. What I was watching didn't roll. It placed each leg down like it was thinking about it, like a person testing ice. And there was no swing to the body above the legs at all. I actually said out loud, "To nobody, that's not a moose," before I'd even worked out why I believed it. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the ditch line, and I slowed down more, waiting for the reed to correct itself, waiting for it to flick an ear or shift its weight. Every animal I have ever watched, and I mean every single one, even the ones bedded down asleep, has what guides call leakage, a tail twitch, a weight shift off one hip, breathing that moves the ribs enough to catch in headlights. This thing gave me none of that. Not a twitch. It had the stillness of a photograph, not the stillness of a living thing holding a position. And you know the difference in your gut a long time before you can put it into words. I told myself, fine, not a moose. Has to be a bear standing up checking the air. They'll do that. So I ran the bear checklist instead. Except the forelimbs were wrong for that too. Too long, hanging past where a bear's would sit against the torso, and the hindquarters had no width to them at all. A standing bear is built like a keg with legs. This was narrow all the way down, and by then I'd slowed the truck to a crawl, still rolling toward it. I hit my brights, which is second nature. You do it to catch eye shine and confirm species by the color and the height off the ground. Moose throw a dim gold. Bear throws more orange-red. What came back was nothing for almost a full
second,
which is a long time when you're 40 yards off, a dark highway staring at something, and then 2 points of light came up like someone working a dimmer switch late. Not instant, like every other set of animal eyes I'd lit up in 22 years. Delayed. That's the word I keep landing on. By then I'd gone from curious to careful, and I started paying attention to where it was standing, instead of just what it looked like. And that's when I noticed it was sitting exactly on the line where my headlight throw faded into shadow. Not in the light, not in the dark. Right on the seam between the two, like it had measured it. Animals don't do that. They bolt from light, or they don't care about it at all, and just happen to be wherever they happen to be. This thing was positioned like it understood the exact reach of 2 sealed beam headlights on a Ford. And that is not a small detail. That's a deliberate one. I've closed distance on plenty of animals in my life, slow and quiet, because how something answers you closing ground tells you what it is. So I eased the truck forward another 15, 20 feet. A real animal reorients its whole stance when you do that. This thing took one small step sideways back into the trees just enough, and landed on that exact same seam of light and shadow. It wasn't reacting to the truck getting closer. It was reacting to keep itself in the same spot relative to the light. And I didn't have a box in my head for that. I've called in animals my whole life with a bleat or a grunt, so I rolled the window down 2 inches and gave a short call out of habit more than plan, just to see what I'd get. Every animal on Earth answers a sound like that with a snap, a jerk of the head toward the source, because that's how a prey brain is wired, fast and involuntary. What turned toward me instead was smooth, controlled, like somebody hearing their name across a room and turning to see who said it. My hand was on the door handle before I decided to put it there. It was cold enough by then that my own breath was fogging up the cab every time I exhaled. Cold enough that anything warm-blooded standing out there should have had a little cloud coming off its mouth every few seconds. Same as a horse in a paddock in January. I looked for it, because at that point I was looking for anything that would let me put this back in the animal column. There wasn't any. No fog. Nothing. In temperatures where I could see my own breath and had seen the moose I'd passed 20 minutes earlier blowing steam like a kettle. I reached back behind the bench seat for my rifle, still in its soft case, no real noise to it, more muscle memory than any decision to do anything with it. And its head came around toward me before my hand had even closed on the stock. Not toward a sound, because there wasn't one yet. Toward the intention is the only way I've ever been able to say it. I know exactly how that sounds. I was there and you weren't. And I've replayed the timing of it 1,000 times since, and never once managed to explain it away. Right about then, my headlights dipped half a second, and the radio, which had been playing low the whole drive, dropped to static and came back. I want to be fair to the mechanical explanation. Trucks do strange electrical things in the cold, and I told myself that because I needed to tell myself something. But I kept that truck 6 more years after that night, through colder nights than that one, and it never did it again. Not once. Then it crossed the distance to the actual tree line, 12 or 15 feet of open ditch. In a way I still can't call walking or running or bounding, because I did not see the steps that should have filled the space in between. 1 second it was on that seam of light. The next, it was at the tree line. I've watched a lot of animals move, slow motion, real time, all of it, and there is always a middle. There was no middle here. That stretch of willow and alder runs dry that time of year. Dry enough that a squirrel crossing it sounds like somebody crumpling a bag of chips, and a moose or a bear pushing through it is loud. Branches snapping, brush thrashing, noise that carries a good 10 or 15 seconds after you've lost sight of the animal. I heard nothing, not a snap. The brush at the edge of my headlights didn't even move. I sat there with the truck running for longer than I'd like to admit. And then I did something I'm not proud of and wouldn't recommend to anybody. I got out, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, and walked up to that exact seam of light and shadow where it had stood for a good 2 minutes by my count. Frost was forming on the grass everywhere else along that shoulder. Where it had stood, the frost was untouched. No print, no flattened grass, no scuff in the gravel at the ditch line. 2 minutes of a few 100 pounds of anything standing in one small spot leaves a mark on frost-covered ground. I checked with the flashlight for close to 10 minutes, widening the circle, and found nothing, which was somehow worse than finding something would have been. I didn't tell anybody for a couple weeks. When I finally did, I told an old buddy of mine who'd hunted longer than I had, figuring he'd either laugh at me or hand me some piece of animal behavior I'd somehow missed in 22 years. And I badly wanted that second option. Instead, he went quiet on the phone for a second and asked me, real careful, whether it had turned its head slow when I made noise, like it heard its name called. I hadn't told him that part yet. I hadn't told anybody that part. That's the detail that still sits wrong with me more than the sighting itself. Because it meant this wasn't only mine. Turned out his cousin had driven that same stretch of highway about 2 weeks before I did. Same year, same hour of the night. And had pulled over for what she thought was a moose down in the ditch. The one detail she kept repeating to him out of the whole thing was that when she tapped her horn, it turned to look at her slow and deliberate, like a person would, not like an animal startling. 2 people, 2 weeks apart, same stretch of road, same exact detail, and neither of us had spoken to the other before that phone call. I don't have a tidy way to explain that, and I stopped looking for one a long time ago. I hunted twice more that fall, mostly out of stubbornness, and both times I spent more energy watching my own back than reading sign ahead of me, which is no way to be out there, because that kind of attention is exactly what keeps you alive, around the animals that can genuinely kill you. My whole skill set, everything I'd built over 22 years, was a way of reading the woods so I'd always know what was dangerous and what wasn't. For one evening on the park's highway, that reading came back with an answer I had no category for, and it never fully came back online after that. I sold the rifles the next spring. Not because I think something's waiting in the trees for me, because the thing I trusted most out there, my own ability to look at a shape in the dark and know exactly what I was looking at, failed completely just once, and I never found a way to trust it all the way again. I moved up to Alaska in the spring of 2021 for a construction contract out past Chitina, helping shore up some of the old buildings near the mine road. I'd never driven anything rural before that. Grew up in the suburbs, learned to drive on 4-lane roads with street lights every 50 yards. So when they handed me a truck and told me the job site was 40 minutes past, where the pavement gives up, I didn't think much of it. A road's a road. The Edgerton Highway is the only way in or out of that stretch of the state, running from the junction near Copper Center down through the hills to the river crossing at Chitina. Most of it's paved, some of it isn't, and it's the kind of drive where you go 20 minutes without seeing another car. I'd made the run a dozen times by October, always in daylight, always fine. The day it happened, I was running a supply pickup and got stuck behind paperwork at the hardware store in Glen Allen longer than I planned. By the time I gassed up at the last stop by a far highway narrows, the sun was already low enough that I knew I'd be finishing the drive in the dark, which I hadn't done before. The guy running the pumps was maybe 70, flannel over a thermal shirt, the kind of face that spent 40 winters outside. He noticed my plates were a rental company's and asked where I was headed. I told him Chitina, and he just looked at me for a second longer than felt normal for small talk. He said, if I hadn't run that road after dark before, I should turn around and wait till morning. I laughed it off, told him I had somewhere to be. He didn't laugh back. He said fine, but if I was going to do it anyway, there was one stretch, past the second bridge, where the road dips down near the flats, where I needed to not slow down and not stop, no matter what I saw or heard. He said if the radio cut to static, that was normal. Just keep my foot steady and drive through it like nothing happened. Then he went back to the register like he'd just told me the store closed at 9. I remember thinking it was the kind of thing small towns do to mess with new guys. I'd heard some Alaska transplant stories about this exact kind of thing, the old-timer test. See if the city kid gets spooked. I paid for gas, said thanks, and pulled out laughing about it to myself. The first 20 minutes were nothing. Mountains going purple with the last light, river running low and silver off to the side, the kind of drive that makes you understand why people move out here in the first place. I had the radio on some AM station out of Valdez, half static already just from the terrain, and I was thinking about dinner, not about some old man's warning. Then I came around a bend and had to slow down for real, because there were crosses, not one. 6 or 7 of them, staked into the gravel shoulder in a cluster, weathered different amounts, like they'd been put there over years and not all at once. I'd driven this road plenty of times in daylight and never noticed them. Maybe because I'd never had a reason to look. Alaska's got roadside memorials all over, sure, but never that many in one 20-foot stretch. That's when the thing the old man said has stopped being a joke in my head. Because a road doesn't get a reputation over nothing. I kept driving, slower now, more alert, telling myself it was just a bad curve, drunk drivers, black ice, whatever explanation fit, and let me keep moving. About 10 minutes later, the temperature gauge in the truck ticked down 2 degrees in about a minute, which I noticed because I'd been staring at it. And then the fog came up off the river flats, so fast it looked like it had been waiting for me. One second, I had sight lines for a quarter mile. The next, I had maybe 40 feet. Low and white and moving in that way fog does when it's rolling instead of sitting still. I eased off the gas without meaning to, and that's when the radio went from static to nothing, then back to a different station entirely. One I didn't recognize, playing something I couldn't place, and then dead air. Exactly what he'd said would happen. I remember my hands getting tight on the wheel, not because of what was on the radio, but because a stranger at a gas pump had predicted it an hour earlier, like he was reading a weather report. I kept my foot steady like he told me, even though every instinct wanted to break. And then, maybe 30 feet ahead in the fog, standing dead center in my lane, was something tall and pale that for one full second my brain filed under person. No car anywhere near it. No reason for anyone to be standing in the middle of a highway at dusk in the fog. And it wasn't moving. I don't know what it actually was. I want to say moose because that's the responsible answer. And there was definitely an animal shape to it once I got close enough that my headlights caught it right. A moose standing broadside, head down. Not spooked by me at all. But for that first second, before my eyes sorted it out, it did not look like an animal. And the shape of it standing so still in the middle of the fog is the part that still sits wrong with me. I hauled the wheel right to go around it and felt the back end break loose on a patch of ice that had no business being there in October. Not yet. Not this early in the season. The truck fishtailed. I overcorrected, felt the tires bite gravel one gut drop second where I was sure I was going into the ditch. And then the truck straightened out and I was past the moose, past the fog bank, and the guardrail on the right side came back into view like the road had just decided to let me go. Nah, I didn't stop until I hit the pullout by the second bridge. Engine still running, both hands still locked on the wheel, like they hadn't gotten the message that we'd stopped moving. I sat there for a solid 5 minutes just breathing. A state maintenance truck pulled in behind me not long after, yellow lights on top, and the driver got out to check if I was broken down. I told him I was fine, just needed a second, and then, half joking to cover how rattled I actually was, I told him about the fog and the animal and the radio cutting out right where the gas station guy said it would. The maintenance driver's face didn't do anything dramatic. He just nodded once, said, "Yeah, that's why we don't run it after dark if we can help it." Got back in his truck and left. No explanation, no follow-up questions. Like I'd told him it had rained. That response bothered me more than the fog had. It meant this wasn't a story one old man told new guys for fun. It was something the people who actually maintained that road already knew and didn't feel like discussing with a stranger. I finished the drive to Chitina with my speed never going above 30, and that night, back at the place I was staying, I couldn't let it go. I started digging, expecting to find nothing, or maybe some old local legend with a name and a ghost attached to it. The kind of thing that would let me feel silly about how scared I'd been. What I found instead was a lot less dramatic and a lot harder to shake off. There's a stretch on that section of highway where a spring-fed creek runs close enough to the road that it doesn't fully freeze even when the air does. And when the ground cools faster than the water, it throws fog straight up off the flats in exactly the kind of fast, low-lying bank I'd driven through. Combine that with the road dipping down right there, and you get a pocket that holds cold air and moisture like a bowl, which is also exactly the kind of spot that turns to black ice first and holds it longest, because the sun barely reaches that stretch once the mountains start throwing shade in the afternoon. It's a known cold air drainage pattern, the kind that shows up in state road hazard notes. Not ghost stories. The radio dropping out had an explanation too. Something to do with the canyon walls on either side of that dip-blocking line of sight to the repeater towers. A known dead zone that shows up on local CB chatter going back decades. Drivers warning each other the same way that old man had warned me. Mouth to mouth. No sign, no official notice. Just people passing along what they'd learned the hard way. And the crosses. I found local news archive mentions going back better than 30 years. Single vehicle accidents, always at night, always in that same short run of road. Drivers going off into the flats or clipping the guardrail trying to avoid wildlife they couldn't see coming until it was standing in their lane. Nothing supernatural in any of it. Just cold air, bad timing, and moose that like standing in a warm pocket of fog because it beats standing in the wind. What actually got to me wasn't any of that. It was realizing the old man's exact instructions. Don't stop, don't slow down, expect the radio to cut out, weren't superstition dressed up as advice. They were just correct. Braking on that stretch is what puts you into the skid. Slowing down is what gives the animals in the fog time to become a problem, instead of a blur you clear before you understand what you saw. He wasn't warning me about a haunting. He was handing me, almost word for word, the only driving advice that actually works on a known hazard that the state has never bothered to put a sign on, because, as far as I could tell, it still doesn't have one. I drive that road plenty now. Always before dark, always with a full tank, so I'm never tempted to push it close to dusk. And every time I pass that dip in the flats, I think about how many people are going to drive through it tonight, with no idea any of this is sitting there waiting for the temperature to drop the right 2 degrees. Because nobody put it on a map, and the only people who know are the ones who've already been through it once.